In a sense, we tried to use these institutions as incentives, as carrots and sticks, to try to build support among developing countries and to put pressure on communist countries who were our rivals in the Cold War. The big change in that dynamic came about in the 1980s and 90s. From where we sit in 2011, and thinking that a lot of the folks here today, a lot of you today, were probably born about the time that the Cold War came to an end. It's hard, perhaps, to imagine how appealing communism and the communist ideology was, and communist thought. It's hard to imagine what kind of rivalry the Cold War really was. It was very intense. When I first went to Africa in 1990, just as the Berlin Wall had been knocked down and just before the Soviet Union collapsed, there were still quite a lot of African countries who were modeling themselves on East Germany or Czechoslovakia or Hungary. That was the economic model they aspired to, because those countries had single-party states and some degree of development, and the African political leadership was keen to hang on to a single-party political systems that they could control and at the same time achieve some development. And so there really was a rivalry for the affections of a great many countries around the world for whom on one side they would look and say, well, you know, what we're hearing from the West sounds good, but what we're hearing from the communist powers doesn't sound too bad either. And if you want to look at it in a cynical way, a lot of those countries would try to play one side off against the other and see what benefits they could get, whether it was from, you know, the World Bank or whether it was from aid or you know, direct bilateral aid. The big changes, well, I put up here the collapse of the Soviet Union. I should also have put up another change, and that was the decision of China to begin adopting market-oriented reforms. That really spelled the end of sort of communist economic ideology as an appealing model for the rest of the world, for the developing world in particular. And so that, I think, is really the dynamic that gave rise to globalization. Globalization meaning that most countries in the world then agreed that the right way to organize your economy was on market terms, letting supply and demand more or less decide what the outcomes are in your economy, and to trade and invest with each other on those terms. And so what we got was large countries like China and India working very hard to try to follow the path that Japan had blazed in the 1960s, that Korea and Taiwan had blazed in the 1980s, of rapid industrialization, of export-led development. And there was opportunities, but it also means that low-skilled labor in your own country will find itself in less demand, and will have to find, you know, the people who might work in a textile factory in North Carolina that gets closed may not be able to find another textile factory to work in. They may have to find new jobs, find new ways to make a living. And that brings structural change. And so then the challenge for those countries is to figure out how to facilitate that, how to help workers whose jobs are no longer there to acquire new skills and to find new lines of work. through the late 1990s, and particularly the period, say, from the Asian financial crisis into the mid-2000s, it was possible to look at the United States economy as very much an engine of the global economy, because it had a very open market. So many countries that were looking to export their way to economic development, found a market. Many of them found a market in the United States, and the U.S. was growing faster than, on average, than most other developed countries. It was displaying an ability to adjust to structural changes in a way that other developed countries were having trouble doing. Japan was in the aftermath of the end of its bubble economy. European countries were dealing with rigid labor markets and having trouble responding to the structural changes that globalization brought to them. Along with that, the United States had its issues then and still does. A pretty big trade deficit, a rising fiscal deficit, rising national debt. Things that you can't sustain forever. Along with all of that, what you saw was the United States and its partners in trade, in finance, investment, including Japan, becoming more and more connected to each other, more and more reliant on each other. I can't think of a better example of how interconnected we've become than to think that when the earthquake in Tohoku shut down plants that were producing auto parts, you had auto assembly factories in places like Tennessee in the Midwestern United States that had to shut down because they couldn't get the parts they needed from the producers in Tohoku. I'd say probably most people in Tennessee couldn't tell you where Tohoku is, and most people in Tohoku, I wonder if they would know where Tennessee is, and yet they have this kind of a connection as a result of globalization. So let's look a little more closely at the U.S. economy. I've talked a little bit about trade and finance. I want to talk a little more about innovation in the U.S. economy and how the U.S. how the U.S. got into a position of being able to deal with globalization so well compared with so many other countries. A lot of it has to do with the nature of its market system, the way the U.S. system fosters innovation, and the ground was really set for it by a move toward deregulation in the 1970s. It is clearest in the fields of transport and telecommunications, where these were tightly regulated sectors in the 1970s, and they went through major changes in the 70s and 80s that made them much more flexible and created a much more fluid market, if you will. Deregulation of the airline industry, so freer competition in airlines. Deregulation of telephone companies, so that you had an ability for new people to start firms and to enter the market and introduce new ways of doing things. And greater competition leading to better, more efficiency, and just all around. By promoting competition, what we ended up with was a much more flexible market, and a market that was much more responsive to the changes that globalization brought. I want to talk a little bit about innovation. I guess one of the real sort of unique aspects of the U.S. economy, compared both to developed countries in Europe and perhaps even more so to Japan, is that in the United States there's a system that allows you to fail and try again. It's linked, I think, to the American concept of a frontier spirit. In the history of the United States, as the United States expanded westward, there was a long period of history, basically from the 17th century up till the beginning of the 20th century, where the country was continuing to expand to the west. And so if you immigrated to the United States, right there you had a new chance to start something over again, to start a new activity, to reinvent yourself. And if you landed in New York or Philadelphia on the East Coast and things didn't go well, you could pick up and go out to Western territories where they might not have big cities, but they also had a lot of open space, both physically having open space, but also socially having open space to try new things, to reinvent yourself, to take another shot at it. And I think it's fair to say that that history has helped give us a culture where if you want to start a company in the US, and you have a good idea, and you can convince investors that you know what you're doing, or banks that you know what you're doing, under normal circumstances, it would be possible for you to get the money you need to start your business. And maybe your business will fail spectacularly. Maybe it'll just fall flat on its face. But that doesn't mean the end of your career if you can learn from that experience and come up with another good idea. It's still possible to convince banks and investors that maybe you've got something that's worth them putting their money into. And so you get another shot. In a way that I don't think is possible, that people tell me isn't possible in Japan, though I wonder, but in Europe as well. That the social context in those places is tighter and less forgiving of failure. So when you add up all these companies, all these entrepreneurs, all these people trying different things, and some of them failing and some of them succeeding, ultimately what you get, if it works right, at least in theory, is that you get human resources and financial resources going to the activities, to the companies, to the firms that have the most potential. And you have a process in which banks, investors, and not so much the government makes a decision on what projects get financed. Why is that important? Well, if you look at, I'm just to build on this a little bit, if you look a little bit at how, some of the traits of the United States and how it's developed, the qualities of, the way people think about government in the U.S., they don't have a lot of trust in government. They have much more trust in the private sector. They have much more confidence in the markets to come up with the right answers to things. And so they have this culture of fostering market-led innovation, and they have a unique ability to keep moving resources, capital, finance, from things that don't work, out of things that don't work, and into things that do work. If you look at, this is a very, very simplified characterization, so forgive